Greetings. Welcome back to another Truth Factor discussion. The time each week we come together to study the Word of God and factor the truth of God's Word into our life and hopefully your life as well. Here in a moment, we'll be continuing our study through the Gospel of John. We're in John chapter 19, starting with verse 1. Well, let's go ahead and bring our this is a limited edition of Truth Factor because we had limited people here today. Brian is not able to be with us. Tom, likewise, is unable to be with us. And Bob and Brendan also. But we have Paul and Caleb. Paul, we missed you last week. You doing all right?
Yeah, doing great. Thank you.
Good. Caleb, how's things going down in Lawton?
We're doing okay.
Nice. All right. Well, let me go ahead and give the standard invitation to participate. If you've joined us on the Facebook side of the world, feel free to comment on this live video stream. Let us know what you have to think. If you have any thoughts, comments, or questions about the study, you can drop it in there. If you have joined us on our YouTube channel, do the same thing there with the chat area. And also, if you'd like to email us, wrong button. My buttons are messed up. Who messed up my buttons?
Somebody's been pushing your buttons.
I guess so. Well, I'll do it manually here. Anyway, you can email us. Send your emails to questions@truthfactorlive.com. You can also use questions@truthfactor.com. That would work too. Matter of fact, I was working to update that graphic earlier and did not get it completed in time. But you can also email others, all the participants in the study, Paul at, Caleb at, John at truthfactor.com. And you'll see all that on the screen there. Okay. Bear with me just a moment. I'm going to find out. So that one works. And that one works. And that one works. That one works. That one works. And that doesn't work. So we won't bring that one back up. Okay. Nothing like breaking something and you don't know how you broke that something. All right, so we're going to pick up in John chapter 19 this morning. And we have Stephanie with us, and Jared's with us also. David, it's good to see you. Jimmy, good to have you with us from the fine state of Texas. I'd love to appreciate you joining us for our study today. Paul, let's go ahead and start reading in chapter 19. And we are picking up in John's account. We've just seen them choose Barabbas over Jesus, and we talked about this in our previous study. But let's start in verse 1 of chapter 19, and let's read down through verse 16, kind of get a good look at the context here.
All right, I'd be happy to do that. I'll go ahead and read out of the New King James Version if that's what you have up.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I can switch here on the fly. But we'll read John 19, 1 through 16. It says, "So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' And they struck him with their hands. Pilate then went out again and said to them, 'Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him.' Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, 'Behold the man.' Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, 'Crucify him! Crucify him!' Pilate said to them, 'You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him.' The Jews answered him, 'We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God.' Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and went again into the praetorium, and said to Jesus, 'Where are you from?' But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, 'Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?' Jesus answered, 'You could have no power at all against me, unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. Then they took Jesus and led him away.
All righty. All right. Thank you, Mr. Paul. Now, there's several things, of course, within this passage. I'll tell you what, since it's just the two of y'all, I'm going to leave you both on gallery view. That way, see both at the same time. So don't go combing your hair or anything while you're on camera, Caleb. Several things here within the context, Paul, that I thought was interesting. First thing to note had to do with the fact, so depending on how you view the account of this, Jesus appears to have been scourged twice. Okay. First time before the, at the outset of it, basically at this point. And then later, of course, after the sentencing is accomplished. What I found interesting, Paul, in looking at that is apparently there's a difference in the Greek words used in regards to the term scourging. And the thought is that the first scourging would have been for like minor crimes and not as thorough of a scourging. But then the other one was the one that was more brutal, at least in some thoughts about that. Any thoughts on that?
I know only what I've read because in our culture, scourging doesn't take place. But it's my understanding that from a severe scourging, there were some who did not survive. Is what I've heard about from that ancient culture. That it could itself be fatal. There was typically, and not to be overly gross about it, but there was typically a lot of blood loss, and certainly we see after this that Jesus is in a very weakened condition, and so that would kind of follow. Probably there was some blood loss in the crown of thorns that's applied to him.
Yeah.
I don't know. We don't read exactly how that was applied, but I don't picture this being a gentle crowning. That because they're already striking him with their hands and all of this, but it was for the one who deserves the greatest honor of any who ever walked on this earth. He is treated with great disrespect. I think there's a lot of pain in that myself. I realize there's a lot of physical pain, just horrible agony. But I also think that there had to be a lot of emotional pain with knowing who he was, and not a matter of pride, but just knowing who he was, that he came from the Father. And here they are treating him with such disdain and such disrespect, and not acknowledging who he really is at all.
All right. That's a good point. Caleb, any thoughts?
Well, see, me and my wife were talking about this last night, about the scourging of Jesus. The Romans teach, I mean, not the Romans, the Catholics, because they have the shroud, right? They teach, that it was a whip, and we've studied, I think several of us have studied through that. We don't really know for a fact. You look at the definition, it could be whipped, could be beaten. there's several different things that's going on, and I'm trying to find the passage you were talking about, John, where there's two different definitions there. I hadn't thought about that before.
All right,
That
so
maybe there's two different
so
levels.
so what is I'll walk you through, and this was kind of the suggestion
Okay.
in John 19. I'll use this one as an example here, real quick. And when it says that they took Pilate out to scourge him, bring that view up there for just a moment. You'll notice that this Greek word mastaguo, not sure of the pronunciation on it, but it's 3146, means simply to scourge. But and this is kind of at the start of this, prior to the conviction process. But then when you jump over to Matthew 27, and I think the same thing exists in Mark's account, there in verse
Yeah,
26,
15.
then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus. Now this one is Fregi Luo. It's 54:17. And
Yeah.
it's so the thought, and I think Luke's account also uses a lesser form in Luke 23:16, at the outset of it. And so at least what I was reading, the suggestion is that the first scourging would have been for like a minor crime, kind of the rough them up and everything type thing. And that was then followed with what Paul was talking about with the crown of thorns and then the purple robe. But then the latter one would have been, and Paul, you talked about people not surviving the scourging. That very well could have been the latter one. And at least the theory is that once the conviction was done, then here comes the much worse scourging process. Now, there's not agreement on that. Some view all these talking about the very same event, not broken up between before and after. But anyway, that's why. In Matthew and Mark's account, they use a different word together for scourging than what's used in John 19:1 and Luke 23:16.
Yeah, I wouldn't have an issue if I don't mean to say he was only scourged once, because it was a
Yeah.
horrible thing, but I wouldn't have an issue with the idea that all the accounts are just pointing out that
Yeah.
Pilate had Jesus scourged, that was a fact of what happened, and whether it was twice or whether it was once, and whether it was a lesser and a greater, no controversy there as far as
Yeah.
I'm concerned.
And then think about after all that scourging, and then the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate brings him out. I think maybe, and we'll get to this here in a minute, Pilate was hoping they'd have sympathy on him, seeing him in such
Yeah.
a beaten and horrible state.
There's some thought about the purple robe that after he was scourged, the back was, again, I'm only going from what I've read from historians about this kind of thing, that when they would put the robe on him, that the blood would begin to coagulate, and then we read later that they take it off of him, and there would be additional suffering that took place with that, taking off something that had attached itself to the wounds.
I can see that. Yeah. Definitely could see that. David Clark made a quick comment. Let me bring it in here. He says, you couldn't strike him more than 40 times. And we kind of pulled that a little bit from Paul's statement that he was beaten with 39, 49 stripes, save one, or something like that is the wording. But yeah, it wasn't 40. But this was Roman scourging. So I don't know if this would be the same as what Paul underwent. Beat, 3 times, once left for dead, or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think. I'm not sure. Pilate ruling over a very Jewish area, if he would have respected that or not. But certainly, in general, the Romans would not have given much credence to what the Jews' rules were.
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, he suggests they go out and crucify him for themselves, but they wouldn't be, in his own law, they wouldn't be permitted to do that. So,
yeah. And real quick, and then we'll move on. But the sheer mockery, as you already talked about, Paul, putting on the crowns of thorns and put him in a purple robe, and then they said, "Hail!" And normally they say, "Hail, Caesar," but in this point they threw a mockery of that, "Hail, King of the Jews," to him, and then after that he says, "Behold, I bring him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault with him." And Caleb, I thought this was an interesting point that I read earlier. And really, you see this when you look at the text. The number of times Pilate would go out and speak to the Jews because they weren't going to come in there and be defiled. He would go talk to them and come back and talk to Jesus. Then he'd go out and talk to them again, come back and talk to Jesus. And then he would take Jesus out there and then come back in and bring Jesus back in and talk to him again. It's just a number of times there. It would have been, I don't know what it would have been like to have seen it.
Yeah, it's interesting, when you're looking at Pilate, because you skip that trial when he sends him to Herod in John's account. You're like, why did, it seems like Pilate flips for no reason. He's found no fault in him. He knows Jesus is innocent. He claims that multiple times that Jesus is innocent. And of course, he tries to release Jesus. He offers Barabbas. He scourges them as a substitute. If I punish him enough, maybe they'll let him live because he's not guilty. And of course, they still say, crucify him. And they really, it's funny because as you're going through the different trials, they change their charge from him blaspheming to him claiming, he's greater than Caesar. And that's what they're going to take to the Romans, right? They go from a religious charge to a political charge. But here in John 19, they go back to what their real reason with him is he claims to be God. He claims to be the Son of God. And of course, Pilate wants to know more about it, but Jesus isn't going to answer him because he knows he has to go to the cross. He knows what he has to say or not say in order to help them get him to where God wants him to be.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about that. Go ahead, Paul. Mm-hmm.
It's pretty evident that Pilate wants to release him. And so I kind of wonder exactly, and I've tried to ponder this a little bit, verse 5, where he brings him out to the crowd. Jesus has the crown of thorns on him and the purple robe, and he says, "Behold the man." And he's obviously suffering a great deal from all that's been done to him. He's been humiliated and ridiculed. And I wonder if that's Pilate saying, like he says later, "Here's your king," or if it is more, look, here's what he's been reduced to. Why don't we call that enough? Maybe looking for some, I don't know if sympathy's the right word, or at least some idea that maybe he's suffered enough. I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't know exactly what Pilate means with "behold the man," but he doesn't call him a king there. So I think maybe the idea could be that look at how he has suffered. Look at what we've done to him. I've been wanting to release him, and so let's do that, because in response to that, they cry out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate says, "You take him and crucify him." So I don't know, just a thought.
Well, I'm going to bring something up on the screen real quick. This is from the ESV Study Bible in regards to that phrase, "Behold the man." And they write, "Behold the man," I guess Latin for Ecce homo, ECCEHOMO. I don't speak Latin, barely speak English. Probably conveys the sense, look at the poor fellow. In other words, what possible threat could this man pose to the government or to anyone else? Potentially, at least that's kind of their
I guess that's kind of what I was trying to say, but they do a much better job than I do.
No, I think it's reasonable. I should say. I think it's very, very reasonable. Caleb, you got any thoughts on it?
Well, I think it's interesting. You go through this whole deal, and it really goes to show you how much Jesus suffered. I think Paul was making the point earlier, because he dies first.
Yeah.
So I assume that the two that were crucified with him weren't scourged and beaten and had to go through all that before, because Jesus ultimately is going to die before they do, which fulfills the prophecy that no bones were going to be broken, and he was going to be pierced through the side. So all these things had to take place. It was part of God's plan for him to suffer these things the way he did, to fulfill exactly what God said was going to happen 1,000 years before. Which is really a point you have to make all the time, is none of this is by chance. It's all through God's providence, and he knows what's going to happen.
And matter of fact, he's going to say that a little bit later here in the text, Jesus himself. We'll make that comment about who's responsible for this effectively, or who has given you the power, and then who delivered him. One thing we talked about last week, and I think, was it Brian that suggested this? They hollered out, crucify him, crucify him. In the other gospel accounts, he brings out Barabbas, and they said, release Barabbas. And he said, what would you want me to do with Jesus? And they said, crucify him. And so it was suggested last week that Barabbas was in line to be crucified that day. He was the one for whom the third cross was prepared for. But instead, when they hollered out, crucify him, they chose that form of execution for Jesus instead of it being for Barabbas, and he was released. So that's an interesting point. All right, let's see. Okay, and Paul, and one of you already talked about, you take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. Jesus says, verse 7, Caleb, you introduced this just a moment ago. So they said, we have a law, according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Is that relatively accurate to what the law taught? The reason why I asked that is you probably have a footnote in your Bibles of Leviticus 24, verse 16. And let's jump over there, and then I'll bring it up on the screen. In Leviticus 24, there in verse 16, we have, and whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall certainly stone him, the stranger as well as him who is born in the land. Then when he blasphemes the name of the Lord, he shall be put to death. I wonder if that's the law that they are referencing. That's
well, that seems to be the law. Yeah, that seems to be the law that everybody points to. I know that Jews today will argue that point, that they put Jesus to death for something that's not even written. So it can't be possible, that's why Jesus isn't really the king, and he's not, this story's made up, or this story's not fully accurate, is because they believe that, they would have never done that. But I think it's pretty clear that you could see that they'd be willing to do anything they can to put Jesus to death. Of course, we know he's innocent.
Yeah.
We know he's perfectly innocent, so they got to come up with something, and that's the closest thing they can come up with. Then that's what they're going to say. But that's their real problem, right?
Yeah.
That's where they have an issue with Jesus. They don't really care that he's claiming to be the king of the Jews. They're just using that for Caesar and to put political pressure on Rome. They don't really care about that. But they're going to use that to take it to the Romans to get permission.
And they oftentimes abuse scriptures to form their own wants and desires, or to bring about their own wants and desires. Yeah, it's a good point.
But you see how serious the Jews kept that law. I mean, they don't. If you're studying through Matthew, they don't use God. They use every substitute possible because they don't want to defame the name of God.
Yeah.
They hold that in high regard. Yahweh is sacred. We'll use these other things to describe who we're talking about, but we hold that higher.
They can't use his name, or they won't say his name, but they will. Yeah.
Right.
All right. Let's see. Jared Dart pipes in the chat room. He says, seems like they loved giving excuses. Yeah, I would think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I would think so. All righty, let's
Well,
see.
well, ultimately,
keep
that's
going.
what Pilate does, right? If you look at Pilate, I'm always interested in looking at his role in the whole thing, because he has the chance to let Jesus go and he doesn't. But you got to look at where Pilate's at politically. That's always the problem with politics. They're always worried about their position and what they're going to lose.
Yeah.
And that's why you're like, why don't people just fix it? Well, they're worried about people's opinions. And the same thing's true with Pilate. He's worried about the people rioting and him losing his position and his life if he doesn't do what they want. He's already on thin ice with everything that was going on with the Jews previously. He had previous offenses that Philo and Josephus mentioned that indicate he was excessively cruel. And as the Roman proctors, they don't last very long. If you look at the intertestamental period, they go through proctors pretty quickly, and so he's concerned about losing his position, maybe even losing his life. So you have that fear of man versus the fear of God.
Yeah.
That everybody has to look at, and that's true for us today. We all have to look at that ourselves and say, are we worried about what man thinks? Are we worried about what God thinks? And of course, we see Pilate go the wrong way because he's worried about this political pressure, all the pressure, maybe on his family and his life if he doesn't go along with the Jews. But his final act is cowardice, as you see in verse 16. And he delivered him over. He gave in.
According to some sources, he only served for about 10 years. Pilate, 26
Which
to
is a
36.
long time. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a long time for proctors, I think, if you look at all the proctors.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. But you're right. He had to appease the people because what is what I'd heard some years ago. If things got unruly, and we see this in Paul. All right, I remember when the mob came together to arrest Paul, and I think it's at the same time they stoned Jason or attacked Jason. But anyway, no, they actually grabbed Paul. Basically, the argument was you've got to settle down because if not, the government will come in on us. Now, that's a bad paraphrase, but somewhere between Acts 1 and 24. I can't remember. But anyway, we see that argument being made that you've got to settle down because you were definitely in an uproar and you're in violation of the law and you need to get it under control. Well, I think Pilate was afraid of the same thing happening here.
Yeah.
And they could very easily, and here in a minute, they're kind of threaten him a little bit. They're going to say to him, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. So that sounds like a veiled threat.
Yeah, I mean, we'll send an envoy and we'll go talk to Caesar ourselves. That's the lengths people are willing to go for political power and political struggle.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking, during the intertestamental period. Wait, we're going all the way. Herod served in Rome before he comes back and rules the Jews. So that's some of the things you learn in the intertestamental period. The political landscape of how much people are willing to travel and go study in Rome to come back. They want to rule. And the Jews aren't afraid to go, hey, we'll take a boat ride for several months just to go to Rome and tell Caesar what's going on and get you kicked out. And so they're not afraid to put all the pressure they can where it needs to be put. And of course, in the back of your mind, you have to think, well, this is all God's plan. He set all this up. And even going back to the Jews entering captivity and them losing the kingdom, losing their king, losing the right to be, a nation, that they're going to be ruled for the rest of the time, and ultimately leading to the Romans being in charge. To even put you in this situation it really just goes to the foreknowledge of God and his plan.
Absolutely. Well, let's go forward a little bit. Paul, any thoughts on that before we go forward?
No, I think that was well stated.
Okay. So let's come back now to verse 7. So the Jews said, because he made himself the Son of God. This didn't sit well with Pilate. When Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid. And he pulls Jesus aside back to the praetorium, and he says, where are you from? Now, there are two things to note here. Didn't Pilate's wife have some sort of dream that caused a bit of fear?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So much so, I think in, I guess John 18, let's see, that wasn't it. I thought it was.
Matthew 27:19
That's it.
is the reference
Yeah.
where, yeah.
She says, well, let me bring it up here real quick. In Matthew 27, verse 18, she says,
Verse 19.
verse 19, thank you. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him, saying, have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him. Now you add that to what he just heard the Jews say that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. But here's the question. Paul, hadn't he already talked to Pilate about his kingdom?
He had a little bit. When we see that, Jesus does not give long speeches to Pilate,
Yeah.
but he initially answers some questions when he's pushed, and he stays without saying very much to Pilate here until verse 11, and then he makes two sentences in my Bible that he says there. But yes, as you have on the screen there, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight. So, Jesus doesn't deny that he's, in fact, here he affirms that he has a kingdom, but it's not that kind of kingdom. He's trying to explain that, just like he tried to get the disciples to understand, but they weren't evidently capable of that just yet. But I think that even when there's something you don't believe in, I think we're all a little susceptible to this kind of mental stimulus. Even if there's something we don't believe in, we can be a little superstitious. And I'm not saying to believe in Jesus would have been superstitious, but Pilate's not a believer. But here he's been warned by his wife. This idea of him being the Son of God, he doesn't. If he was asked, I think, do you believe any of this? He would say, no. But there might be things today that we would ask if we believe in certain things, and we might say, well, of course not. But then something creepy happens, and we get a little superstitious. Not believing in that, but just having some uncertainty about it. Maybe in our minds. But I think that's kind of what seems to happen with Pilate. Is he's not a believer in Jesus, but he knows he's not guilty, and so his wife's warned him. And here's the idea: he's the Son of God. What is all this about? I think there's a lot of questions in Pilate's mind. But is he a believer? No. But is he kind of concerned about what he might do to this man and what that might bring upon him? I think there is a concern there.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting in verse 11 that Jesus points out to him that those who deliver me to you, has the greater sin. Kind of almost easing his mind is it's not as much on you as it is on them. Persuading him maybe a little bit more to just turn him over so he can be crucified. Because they had the greater revelation. They knew who Jesus was. They should have known what God's plan was. And of course they don't. They don't believe. And that's the greater fault. The people that had the more knowledge.
Yeah.
But that doesn't excuse Pilate's actions, of course. God was going to fulfill what he needed to fulfill. Either way, Pilate went. Maybe the Jews would have crucified him anyway. But it's interesting that Jesus, it really helps his conscience maybe a little bit by saying, they have the greater sin. It's on them.
Yeah. Well, that's right. do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you? And Jesus says, you could have no power at all against me unless it has been given you from above. Talking about, going back to what you're talking about, the plan of God. But then he says, therefore the one who delivered me to you has greater sin, whether it's the Pharisees, the leaders, or even Caiaphas, greater sin than Pilate? Now, I hadn't thought about that until just now. When he says has a greater sin in comparison to what? Any thoughts on that? Or there might even not be an intended comparison, just to show that what Pilate's about to do, he's going to do because it's God's will that it be done. But the one who, and this it shows an interesting point, but the one who brought Jesus to him bears responsibility. We know that sovereignty of God, his will always be done. Think back to Nebuchadnezzar and the various other leaders that were instruments of God against God's people. Well, those leaders were still held accountable to God for what they did to his people. Although God was using them, they were still not without accountability for their actions. And so one might argue Caiaphas or the Jews were fulfilling the will of God in delivering Jesus to him. But it still doesn't mean they're without accountability for their deeds.
It's interesting, and I don't know, maybe there's not a real great point to make here, but I've always heard us. I'm sure I've said it too, that sin is sin. All sin is just sin, and there's no worse or better. But here, Jesus talks about a greater sin that's been done. It's not the only place in Scripture that we see that. I'm not saying that some sins will cause you to be lost and some won't. I'm not trying to indicate that. But here, Jesus seems to indicate that one is worse than the other.
That is interesting, isn't it?
Well, I think it could go back to the severity of sin. So sometimes you got to think about the more you know, the more you're going to suffer in hell because you knew better and you should have known, and you had the chance to change your life and you chose not to. I think that's really when you talk about the punishment of those who knew better in hell. Well, yeah, they're going to suffer more because they had the chance and they rejected it, as those who maybe didn't have as many opportunities. But you think about Acts 17 verse 30. Paul brings up, therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent. So there is a time of ignorance for those Gentiles there, that they don't know as much. And what are they being judged on? I don't know how God's judging everything. That's not my end of the stick to look at. But I think it's based on what you know, and Pilate doesn't know as much as they know. And Jesus isn't telling him more because he doesn't want this plan to fall apart and him not go to the cross. That was God's purpose. He's doing God's will. So I think it's interesting to look at, there's some ignorance on Pilate's part of not really knowing the whole truth.
Okay.
And the Jews have no excuse, I think, is Jesus' point.
Yeah.
They know better. They know what they're doing is wrong.
And I think that's a good point. We'll get to that here, we'll talk about here in just a second, because of something they're about to do here in a couple verses there. Passage behind what Caleb was referencing is 2 Peter chapter 2, when he talks about someone who is a believer being led away by the false teachers. He says it'd be better for them to never have known than to have known and fallen away. Is that kind of the idea there? What you're talking about there? And you think about the difference regarding the people who heard Jesus. Why was Jesus, I don't want to say harder, that's not the right term. Jesus was more direct with the Pharisees, you hypocrites, okay? But when the woman who was caught in adultery was brought before him, his demeanor with her was different. Go and sin no more. The individuals who were guilty of sin, go and sin no more. And it's not that he looked lightly upon them, but too much has been given, much will be required, effectively. The Pharisees had much more information there. They should have seen him for who he was. But they denied him, and they even broke the national concept of God being their king. And again, we'll look at that here in just a moment. That idea there. I don't know. There's just we have another comment. Let's go ahead and bring it in. David Clark. David says Jesus gave no resistance. He knew his time was up. And then Stephanie, this goes back to the question of the one who delivered me. She says, could it be Satan? That's a good question. And then she kind of follow up. She says, in that verse is the one singular, not plural. And so there's nothing like getting a question you are not prepared to answer. Let me look that up. First off, I wouldn't argue. Yeah, I wouldn't argue if someone wanted to say the one who delivered him was Satan. But I think from their viewpoint, Pilate may take it as the people who brought Jesus to him.
Well, if you think about it, anybody doing the will of man or doing your own will, you're doing the will of Satan. I mean, you're following the evil one. I mean, there's no ifs and buts about it. That's pretty clear.
Yeah.
So can you take it that way? Sure. I mean, you can. They're following the will of man. That is their only concern, is their position, how much, where their money's going, their political power. That's all the things they're worried about, which is what Satan wants and what Satan offered Jesus when he tempted him. You can have all these kingdoms. And look at all these cities. You could be the ruler. And of course, Jesus tells them he's not here for that. But that's what people are doing when they serve Satan.
Yeah.
They're serving their own personal interests.
I was looking to see if another translation offered a little bit different wording of that might add a little bit to the understanding, but I don't think so. The CSB says, this is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin. They do paraphrase, they do a dynamic equivalency just a little bit to make it definitely more readable. Whereas the ESV says, therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. So I don't have an answer as far as the plural nature. I think it is translated as basically he, meaning one, or in a translated for us in a very singular sense there. So that would be my guess, looking at a few translations.
I think some of them say like to possess or to be. The prime word is to have or hold or possess.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't think Satan really possesses Christ, right? So
yeah,
I think it's really just talking about the Jews. They're the ones that delivered him over.
Yeah.
Because they rejected him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Openly rejected him too at that. Yeah.
Right.
And David asks, is the reference 2 Peter 2:1-2? It is 2 Peter chapter 2, but more specifically down to the end of it here. Let's see, verse 21, where he says, for it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it to turn from the holy commandment delivered to them. But it's happened to them according to the true proverb, a dog returns to his own vomit, and a sow having washed to her wallowing in the mire. That's what we were talking about just a minute ago. And Stephanie says that my interlinear says the word one is singular. Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Well, who's delivering over Christ to Pilate? The high priest, right? I mean, you could point it right back to Caiaphas. Yeah. I mean.
Yeah.
He's the one that really should know above everybody else. He should know the most.
Yeah.
And even he rejected Christ.
All right, let's talk about that for just a moment. No, one more thing before our time runs out. There's two things we need to talk about real briefly. So we talk about the No. Well, we'll go on to the next thing. Pilate brings Jesus out. And notice what he says in verse 14. All right, now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. Some interesting stuff. I didn't silence my phone, sorry. Interesting thoughts about that. But I want to focus on, he said to the Jews, behold your king. They cried out, away with him, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? Now here's leading up to. The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Think about that for a moment. They said, we have no king but Caesar. They've now betrayed everything. You know, first off, God was supposed to be their only king. Even when Saul was appointed as king and then David and Solomon, God was still supposed to be their king. They were supposed to have had that reverence and respect for him. And then
Yeah, God makes that point when he says that they hadn't rejected Samuel. They hadn't rejected Samuel. They had rejected God as their king. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's exactly right. Over there in what was that? Judges 8, verse 23 shows this mindset that you're talking about there. Well, I can't type. There we go. See, this is where you need to blend AI with your Bible program, and it's always listening.
Yeah.
And so anytime we mention a Bible reference, it pops it up there. And well, I've got the wrong verse written down there. Anyway, but you're right, Paul.
Well, John 1:11, you know, going back to the very beginning of John, he says he came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, John's really bringing it full circle there. That they rejected him.
Yeah.
And the onus is on them. That they knew better.
That's right. That's right. It's 1 Samuel 8:7. He, the voice of the people, they have not rejected you, but they've rejected me. Yeah. But here's the other thing. Going back to this statement here that Jesus said, or not Jesus, but the people said, our king is Caesar. What else do you think they were effectively denying? Not even realizing it. But in this statement, there was one other thing that they were denying. They were denying even the messianic prophecy. You know, for years they had been looking forward to a king who would come and sit upon the throne of David, and reign over the world and defeat their great enemies and restore Israel back to a world dominance and reign and so forth. And so when they said, we have no king but Caesar, it might be viewed as they were even now rejecting that messianic promise. Now, I don't think they meant this. I think they were saying this verbally to appease Pilate and make themselves look so much better. Okay? But regardless of the motivation behind saying it, it still betrayed everything at that point. Any thoughts?
Well, Jesus speaks to their spiritual downfall and their national downfall when you look at him entering Jerusalem for the final time, and he weeps over them in Luke 19:41 through 44. He declares to them what's going to happen to them because of this rejection. And ultimately, the nation's going to be no more. It's going to be wiped away. They lose all the records. There's no family lineage anymore because they rejected Christ. And ultimately, they're going to get destroyed.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
So, you could say, they're just saying, it's just like politicians today. They say what they need to say to get elected or to keep power or to gain power, but they don't really believe it.
I've never seen that. Got my fingers crossed. I've never seen it. You're not wrong about that. I think even... Yeah. We won't go into that territory, but I agree with you completely on that. Because I will say this, any type of political government is a machine. It's like a train running. And you might be able to change a couple of parts on it, but in the end, you cannot stop and alter that process. no matter how much you try, good or bad, doesn't matter, and this was their mindset as well. Although they profess to believe in God, they confess to worship Him and everything. They still were out for their own, saving their own skins and everything.
Well, you could say the same, not even bringing politics in. You just bring in different churches. I mean, preachers do the same thing, and faithful gospel preachers will lose their salvation because they'll change things because they don't want people to be upset. They don't want to have to move. So they'll change the truth and whatever they have to do to agree with people, and they'll compromise.
Yeah.
And of course, that leads down the wrong path, which is exactly what happens to the Jews here. They compromise.
Going back to what Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4, preach the word, be instant in season, out of season. Then he says, a time will come where they will not endure sound doctrine, but they will find preachers, heap up teachers, preachers who will teach what they want to hear. Effectively is what he's saying there. And here's kind of the problem. When you've been doing this preaching for 30 years, and this is your livelihood, it just so happens you've been in a congregation that they've agreed with everything that the Bible teaches, the way that you understand it and all that. But then you have to move, and you move to another place, and then you begin to say, wait a minute, they're not as strict as what I have been. They don't, they're holding viewpoints that I would have preached against, and I gotta keep providing for myself. I've got to stay where I'm at. I can't rock the boat. Then the temptation is to dial back and alter and vary a little bit so as not to offend people. It's easy whenever you're a young preacher. No offense, Caleb, but it's easy when you're a young preacher and you have little kids to say, "I will never," or "This will never happen,"
Right.
blah blah blah. Because then when you jump forward 30 years and all your kids are grown and life has changed completely, you find yourself facing those very challenges in which you said, "Well, I will never," and now you come down to, "Will I ever?" And hopefully the answer will always be, this is what the Bible teaches, and we're going to hold what the Bible teaches above all else. But it's very easy to get sucked up into that mindset. And I think you're right. I think the Jewish leaders were partly like this. They wanted to keep power, so they would do or say what they needed to keep that power.
Yeah. And my point is, we sit here and we could bash the Jews and we could bash the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and we could bash them to kingdom come, but we do the same thing. So we got to be careful. We got to look at yourself, because it's real easy to fall into the same traps they fell into.
Yeah.
You know what? Go ahead, Paul.
Caleb, I was just going to say that when I'm studying with people about, a really volatile topic like divorce and remarriage, I preach for people to get that figured out before they ever find themselves in a difficult situation, because it is possible with us that there are things that can influence our judgment. Maybe a child of ours who is in that situation, or maybe it's us in some unhappy situation again. And I think if we haven't got our mind thoroughly made up and our understanding very clear on any issue, then here's something that impacts us in a dramatic, very personal way, and we may not be quite like the Jews in here having this desire to kill someone, but it may be that we really have something in us that impacts us, and it makes it very difficult for us to see things clearly like we need to see them. Sorry, John, I think I interrupted you. I apologize.
Well, what you said was far better. My statement was going to be snarky. I was saying, the reason why you talk bad about other positions many times because it makes you feel good about your position. Whether or not they're truly right or wrong, but the more you bash them, the better you feel about yourself. And that's what I said, Paul. It wasn't that relevant. David Clark says betrayal is still betrayal. And then Jared Dart says sometimes people just agree to disagree or to end the conversation. And that happens sometimes as well. But I do agree with what I think, Caleb, you said. We will speak a lot about the Pharisees, but we're no different than them. And I say we, I mean in general, mankind. We're no different than them. We're still made up the same type of people as made up the Pharisees. We just have to remember not to follow in their self-righteous, self-validating path. We must seek to serve only Him. All right, any thoughts?
Yeah,
Any comments?
the challenge is, say something positive about the Pharisees.
Well, they wore those interesting outfits.
Wasn't it Jesus who said, was it of the Pharisees or was it maybe the scribes? I think it was the Pharisees where Jesus said, do what they teach.
Yeah.
They've got it right, but don't do like they do.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's something good about the Pharisees. They taught accurately. Jesus expected that kind of that kind of strictness with the law.
That's a good point. All right, let's see. Why don't we plan to go ahead and pause the conversation today at starting next week, I should say at verse 17 of John chapter 19. Does that sound good?
Sounds great to me.
Okay. All right. It's a very powerful study looking at what Jesus went through. And I'm sure there's a lot of things here that we could talk about that we didn't really touch on. One thing real quick is this being the day of preparation. Somebody I was reading earlier made the interesting point. The day of preparation, they would have been sacrificing the lambs, preparing them for the meal that they would eat. And Jesus himself was being prepared for sacrifice on that day. And I thought it's an interesting comparison there. So, all right. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us for our study. Thank you so much for your comments, your participation. If you'd like to email us, you can send those to questions@truthfactorlive.com or email us individually, john@paul@caleb@truthfactor.com. And we'll get those and would definitely love to hear from you. All right, well, let's plan to continue this next Thursday, 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time. We'll pick up with John chapter 19, verse 17. If you are living in the Oklahoma City area, our gospel meeting with Ryan Goodwin will begin Sunday morning. So visit our website, seminole.church, for more information about that gospel meeting. Everyone, we will talk to you later, and you'll have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.